Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to City University and to the Cameron Awards and Lecture. My name is George Brock. I'm the Professor and Head of Journalism here. And for anyone who has missed a Cameron occasion or two, I and my colleague, Professor Howard Tumber, have taken over from Hugh Stevenson the organising of the awards and lectures. Many of you will be familiar with the sequence of events. We make 2 awards, and then we hear from tonight's lecturer. And the Cameron Award this evening will be, once again, I'm delighted to say, presented as usual by Moni Cameron, and we're honoured and delighted that she's with us again. The judges this year for the James Cameron Memorial Award reached a rapid consensus that, dramatic as events had been in Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East, that the story which mattered was the global financial crisis, or as everyone knows and abbreviates it in Australia, the GFC. We were looking for a journalist who combined moral vision and professional integrity, who had something of the intellectual subversive and was capable of using language in a very powerful way. We chose a journalist whose prose style is not entirely similar to James Cameron's, but who, in the coverage of the causes and effects, the implications and awkward truths of the economic crisis, leads the field. Ladies and gentlemen, the winner of the Cameron Award for 2012 is Martin Wolf of the Financial Times.
I've been told I can say a few words, but I am aware that you're waiting for a lecture, and I don't want to take too much time between you and the lecture. So first of all, this is an immense honour to me, partly because a number of people I enormously admire have received this award before me, perhaps foremost among them, for me, and it's personal, my former colleague, Michaela Wrong, who is, in my view, one of the great foreign correspondents of our time and has written truly wonderful books. But it is also a great honour because I am old enough to remember James Cameron well as, obviously, a journalist. I didn't know him personally, and admire everything he stood for as a journalist. So among the prizes I've been fortunate to receive, this is an immense honour, even by those standards. Second, I find it quite stunning and astonishing that an award that I would certainly associate with adventurous writing about dangerous places abroad, done by heroic journalists doing real journalism, should be given to somebody like me who sits behind a desk mostly when not braving the underground to go and visit the Chancellor of the Exchequer or maybe the Treasury Secretary in Washington. The idea that journalism should have sunk so low as to regard somebody like me as a reasonable recipient of such an award is, I find, almost shocking. And the only excuse for it, obviously, is indeed, as has been explained, that at least one of, and perhaps one would say the great story of our lifetime, of our current lifetime, of our time now, is indeed this never-ending crisis. And I am sometimes asked for whom this crisis has been good. And I'm afraid the only honest answer to this is I don't know about anybody else, but it has been good for me. I feel quite ashamed of this fact, but I do expect to be able to live off this crisis for many, many more years. I'm sorry about that. But of course, I'm well aware that what I do in analysing events, looking at economic data, trying to understand processes, lacks altogether the glamour, the heroism, the brilliance of real journalism done by my colleagues who risked their lives. I've lost a number of colleagues, even at the FT, over my lifetime, working there in dangerous places abroad, and I regard those as the real journalists. What we perhaps all share, I've just been discussing this with people here at some students here at the School of Journalism, academics I presume. What we all share is a real question about whether the sort of journalism we are used to will actually continue. And there's a very big question about that. Let me just say finally that even though I do feel that what I do is very far short of the standards of moral and otherwise of real journalism, I do think we all do in publications that are moderately serious take their job relatively seriously, as I think the FT does. We perform an absolutely indispensable function without which civilization and democracy certainly could not operate. It's the spirit in which I have myself tried to write my columns over many, many years. So in that respect, we're all in the same business. We're all doing the same thing, which is trying to teach, to advise, to inform, to encourage, to warn. And if this prize is a recognition that even an economics columnist can perform a useful function in that regard, I regard that, for that reason too, as an immense pleasure, an immense honor, and I thank the people who've given it to me very, very gratefully. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, those of you familiar with this occasion will know that we also make a special award generously donated by Marion Kaplan. This award has sometimes been made posthumously, and so it is this evening. We considered it to be fitting recognition for a foreign correspondent doing the kind of dangerous things that Martin was just talking about, whose career was one of extraordinary bravery, perceptive and vivid reporting, and dedication to the reporter's craft. So the special award this year is made to the late Marie Colvin, and will be collected on her behalf by the editor of the Sunday Times, John Witherow.
By all accounts, James Cameron was bloody-minded, opinionated, and sometimes self-righteous in his belief that his own view of the world was the only one that mattered. But he was also brave, shrewd, charismatic, and irrepressible. Nothing could better describe Marie Colvin. Those two were made for each other. As far as I'm aware, they never met. James Cameron died in 1985, and Marie only came to this country from the United States via France shortly afterwards. Her hero was Martha Gellhorn. But in London, she found a group of foreign correspondents who'd been greatly influenced by James Cameron, both by his writings and by his approach to life. And it was an attitude that she herself began to adopt. It was Cameron who forged the template of the foreign correspondent as the iconoclastic anti-hero, not the glamorous figure of the 50s and 60s who tried to make themselves the centre of the story. He wanted to get to the story and to tell readers what was really going on. Had they known each other, she might have seen in him the father figure that she always wanted. Her own father had died when she was young. And I think in her, he would have seen someone like him who was determined to bear witness. It was a phrase Marie always used. She had to bear witness to what was going on out there. But it wasn't just reporting and hard work. Marie was one of the most serious, party-going women in London. What would James Cameron have made of those events in Syria? He wouldn't have sat back in an armchair and opined on it. He would have liked to have gone out there and found out what was going on. And that's exactly what Marie did. She went out, she took considerable risks, and tragically, that final risk that led to her death, and that of Remy Otschlik, the French photojournalist who died with her. Also with Marie was Paul Conroy, our photographer, who was severely injured in the same attack. Many people asked after her death, was it worth it? And it's a debate we still have and still worry about. But I know Marie, and I believe James Cameron, would have not hesitated for a moment in saying, yes, it's always worth it. We have to be there on the front line. So I'm delighted in accepting this cheque on behalf of Marie, and it'll go to the fund that her family have set up for her to promote journalism and foreign reporting in the United States. So thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, this past summer I was doing some research on views of journalism in Britain in the middle of the past century. I came across a BBC radio recording of the writer H.G. Wells talking about the future of newspapers in 1943. Wells loathed the press tycoons of the day, and he was correspondingly keen on anything which might hasten their decline. He told his audience that news in the future would most probably be distributed by telephone. He was kind of right, even if he didn't quite foresee the BlackBerry and the iPhone. In that high, strangulated voice with which men of that era speak from the radio recordings, Wells can be heard saying, "In just a few years' time, newspapers will be dead as mutton." One place in the world where print is not dead as a medium, indeed quite the opposite, is India, the subject of tonight's lecture. It would be difficult, I think, for us to find a better qualified speaker on this subject than N. Ram. He was managing director of The Hindu, based in Chennai. He was the paper's editor from 2003 until the beginning of this year. He's a director of Kasturi & Sons, his family's company which owns The Hindu, and he's a founding trustee of the Media Development Foundation, which runs the Asian College of Journalism. Those bare biographical facts capture neither the considerable importance of The Hindu or Ram's own influence in the debate over journalism in India. You will hear him, for example, in a moment speak of corruption, and he does so with some authority, having played an important role in the disclosure of the Bofors arms and bribery scandal of some years ago. And, unusually for a Cameron lecturer, he actually knew James Cameron. Wrong.
James Cameron, I think, would have got it right. If I were to seek pride in India now, it would in a tiny way be part of my pride. If there were to be disappointment and regret, I must share that regret and in some oblique way accept its responsibility. Only now, after 25 years of knowing India, can I make the presumption of claiming a small share of its rare joys and its frequent sorrows. That's from an Indian summer, which I think is very relevant to the theme that I'm going to address this evening. James Cameron would have got it right about the Indian news media as well. I doubt they were part of his pride when he came upon them or their front ranks with their wildly speculative ways during his first visit to India in 1946, a time when the transfer of power and in the grim background, the partition of India into India and Pakistan were being negotiated. A quarter century later, he was still not impressed with India's newspapers, not to mention state-controlled All India Radio. There was no television in India at that time. Cameron never condescended. He judged from high standards. The self-taught journalist, reporter, broadcaster, occasional illustrator and cartoonist, foreign correspondent, took pride in communicating clearly, precisely, meaningfully. He wrote like an angel when in flow, with descriptive richness, shiningly honest value judgments, and what he called attitude embellishing his art of omission, to borrow a phrase from Robert Louis Stevenson. Cameron, the generous-spirited foreign correspondent who saw history being shaped before his eyes in Vietnam, in Korea, in India, in Cyprus, in Kenya, in the Congo and elsewhere, had many interesting things to say about journalism as it was and as it should be. For one thing, he understood it to be a trade or a calling that can be practiced in many ways. He was clear it was not and never has been a profession, since its practice has neither standards nor sanctions. I think the Leveson Inquiry should be interested in that insight from half a century ago, considering that not much seems to have changed about the essential nature of the trade or calling since that time. By the time Cameron was in his mid-30s, a famous writer and broadcaster, he had formed strikingly original opinions about the craft and art of being a foreign correspondent. When he started out as a reporter, he had decided that, to quote him, facts must never get in the way of the truth. Facts must never get in the way of the truth, as he provocatively put it in An Indian Summer, published in 1974. His reputation as a foreign correspondent was made by persisting with this approach. He was clear that objectivity was of less importance than the truth, and the reporter whose technique was informed by no opinion lacked a very serious dimension. Journalists, therefore, were professionally obliged to present their attitude as vigorously and as persuasively as they could, to be set out for consideration, criticism, and debate. Being scrupulous and consistent about this, he held to be a vital ingredient of moral independence. Among other things, this involved an attitude of mind that will challenge and criticize automatically, thus to destroy or weaken the built-in advantages of all propaganda and special pleading, including the journalist's own, as he put it. It was this highly original attitude and voice that he brought to India as a foreign correspondent in the 1940s, and later as a son-in-law of India, as we say there, after he married Moni, my friend Moni Cameron, who is here with us today with her husband, Sir Dennis Foreman. He loved the country with its enormous diversity and its warm and generous people, as he put it, and was its most consistent and empathetic critic among all the foreign correspondents who have covered its rare joys and frequent sorrows over the years. He was a friend of Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, whom he rated as, quote, incomparably the greatest man I have ever met and a big influence in my life. This was in a Guardian piece in 1975, but no cronyism for this journalist, who did not hesitate to criticize Nehru severely for letting himself, his nation, and his people down. James Cameron was incapable of compromising what he believed to be the truth unfolding before his eyes. He never surrendered his thinking journalist's attitude and voice, his capacity for admiration as well as outrage, his moral independence, and not even Lord Beaverbrook could get one past his apparently nonchalant guard. You can read Cameron to learn about his life in journalism in Point of Departure, or about his tough love for India in An Indian Summer, written after a terrible, life-changing road accident that probably shortened his life eventually. For sheer literary pleasure, you can go to The Best of Cameron, a selection brought out by New English Library in 1981 that should find a place in the library of every good journalism school in the world, but unfortunately it's out of print. I believe this great friend of India would have been spot on about the joys and sorrows of the contemporary Indian news media. I imagine he would have found his pride on the one hand and his disappointment and regret on the other to be in some kind of rough equivalence. This then is the topic I've chosen in consultation with my hosts, in particular Professor George Brock, whom I met for the first time in Vienna, the World Newspaper Congress last year. in consultation for the James Cameron Memorial Lecture this year that I'm honored to give at City University, London. My theme is how India's newspapers, news television, state-controlled radio, and nascent digital media share the best and the worst of traits and practices that we witness around the world, as journalism struggles to come to terms with profoundly changed and changing circumstances that have destabilized the game, whatever spin one chooses to put on it. Let me flag some of the key issues and challenges after disclosing that I've addressed them in papers and essays I published over the years, and especially in a talk to the Contemporary History section of the Indian History Congress last year. I can draw from that bit of research and reflection here, I think. The first issue is the need critically to reflect on and rethink the implications of the buoyant growth story. I won't bother you too much with the statistics. They are readily available elsewhere, but for some relevant figures, they are up there about the reach of the media. They are in millions, and you'll see for the press, television, CNS is cable and satellite, that is satellite television, radio, and so on. The figures are up there, and they're readily available, more detail as well. What they reveal is that India is one of the few places on earth where newspapers still thrive, as Ken Aulata puts it in an article in the New Yorker, in the current issue of the New Yorker. And there are plenty of professional opportunities available for journalists, especially young journalists. The Indian press, especially Indian language newspapers and satellite news television, continue to be in growth mode. Some of that story has been splendidly researched, analyzed, and told by my friend, the political scientist Robin Jeffrey, in his book, India's Newspaper Revolution, published more than a decade ago, and also in a series of articles in that splendid weekly called the Economic and Political Weekly, published in India, in Mumbai. The key factors behind India's newspaper revolution, Jeffrey points out, are improved technology, steadily expanding literacy, better purchasing power, aggressive publishing, and last but not least, political excitement. There is a huge appetite out there for news and what masquerades as news, for analysis, for comment, and of course for entertainment, and also for that hybrid creature, infotainment. All this has spawned tens of influential Indian language daily newspapers, many of them with large circulations and huge readership. But the buoyancy and implications of this print media development must not be romanticized. The social reach of the Indian press is not impressive. It's about 85 copies of daily newspapers per 1,000 in the population, a statistics that fares dismally in any kind of international comparison. This obviously has implications for news coverage. The audience for television is huge, in the region of 563 million and still growing. However, this mass audience is largely for the entertainment channels, the dozens of 24/7 satellite television news channels that compete with the print media in English and in the various Indian languages account for only about 10% of the total TV market in India. There are also signs that the long-expected shakeout is beginning to happen in the news television sector. There are other reasons why the buoyancy of the Indian news media should not be exaggerated. For newspapers, the huge circulation numbers ride on the back of extreme underpricing of cover prices and the printing and dumping of hundreds of thousands of copies that go straight to the raddi or newspaper market for recycling. The latter, a sharp practice to inflate circulation for advertising gain, has become systemic. As though this were not enough, the television audience measurement system, known as TAM, has come under widespread criticism and even frontal legal challenge. What is now clear is that the economics of both the print and broadcast sector has been hardening gradually. The ad market has tightened in the last few years. The catalyst seems to be the global economic slowdown. It has taken its toll of the Indian media growth story, leading some industry experts to rule out any return to the pre-crisis situation, especially in the crucial matter of ad revenues. And how does India fare in the digital age paradox? Let me first try and define this paradox, which is central to this transformational age. On the one hand, more and more people are reading newspapers digitally. You have, for the first time in history, a live global audience for the best publications. There are excellent newspaper and news websites offering rich, many-sided, multimedia content, and the sky seems to be the limit to what you can offer in this exciting space. On the other hand, the existential crisis of the old news media has not been resolved, and it continues to take a heavy toll. The discussions of the future of journalism have not ceased, and poor morale and low spirits continue to haunt the journalistic profession as well as the news media industry, for the simple reason that all this wonderful development has not yet yielded a viable revenue and business model for internet or digital journalism. There can be little doubt that within this digital age paradox, both the print and broadcast media in India continue to benefit from the country's relative backwardness in internet use and broadband access, and from the digital divides that stand out. China's development in this respect has been quite spectacular. At the end of June 2012, it had an estimated 538 million internet users, most of them served by broadband, minimally defined, of course, by Western standards. India, by contrast, has only something like 120 million internet users, most of them poorly served by bandwidth. The most revealing indicator in the comparison is the internet's penetration of the comparable populations, well over 1 billion. China's 40%, which is still only about half the developed country norm, contrasts sharply with India's 10%, 40% and 10%. What this means is that the impact of the digital revolution on the print press and on news television is considerably stronger in China than in India, and that the tipping point is likely to arise sooner in China. It also means that while virtually every Indian newspaper has a website, and some major ones offer informative and attractive digital content to readers in India and abroad, this is secondary to print content by a long chalk. My friend Alan Rusbridger, editor of The Guardian, was recently quoted as saying that journalism is changing at the speed of light. And those who study physics know that's nearly 300,000 kilometers per second. and that virtually every week we are learning new techniques and fresh truths about the way digital technologies are transforming the media, to quote Rusbridger. Within the Indian newspaper industry, there seems to be a sense that the field is changing at the speed of sound, which is 342.29 meters per second. This situation has bred complacency. So there's no real push to learn these new techniques and fresh truths that are so vital to the digital age. According to Jacob Matthew, the first Indian president of WAN IFRA, some studies predict that by 2040, the Indian print industry would meet the fate of the American print media industry, but by then, these studies predict Indian media publishers should be in a position to get a good share of the ad revenue. It seems to me that such predictions and the assumptions behind them reflect a widespread attitude of denial of the proximity, if not the immediacy, of the digital impact. It seems highly improbable that India has until 2040 for the tipping point to arrive. The critical challenge here is the need to come to terms with the convergences observed worldwide, make nuanced assessments of the pace of change, and prepare for the future, including possibly hard times. In critically assessing performance, a clear distinction needs to be drawn and maintained between the state of fortunes of the news media on the one hand and the state of journalism on the other. The point seems obvious enough, but the two states tend to get conflated in public as well as media marketing discourse. High growth rates with animal spirits rampant across the sector may offer opportunities, but they do not guarantee quality. I would now like to turn our focus on the state of journalism in India and raise some relevance and quality issues. To do this, one needs a conceptual framework to look at and evaluate news media functions in society. I've written on this subject and will only offer some shorthand observations here. The long-term Indian press experience, set in a broader framework, suggests two extremely valuable central functions or roles that the country's best newspapers have played in modern and contemporary times. These functions may be termed the credible information function and the critical investigative adversarial function. Performed over time, the two central functions working together build trust in the press, or more accurately, in individual newspapers. They're also valuable derivatives of the two central twin functions. The first derivative is the agency of the press in public education. The second is serving as a critical forum for analysis, disputation, and comment, in which divergent opinions and ideas are discussed, debated, and have it out. A third derivative is agenda building. Socially conscious media can trigger agenda building processes to help produce democratic and progressive outcomes. And this they can do best when an authentic public opinion and a congenial attitude, a congenial context of attitude, feeling, and critical democratic values and practice exist. The third function of the news media is the pastime or entertainment function. I need not get into detail here. The UK as well as India certainly have this in plenty. At its worst, this function seeks to purvey escapist entertainment, celebrity worship, vapid talk shows, scandal, and even voyeurism at the expense of everything else. But it can be something quite different, engaging, entertaining, delving into life's small pleasures, covering hobbies and recreation, pandering to crossword and Sudoku addicts, mixing in humor and satire, and in general serving the pleasure principle as the French use that term. What can we say broadly about the performance of India's news media within this evaluative framework? The Indian press is more than 2 centuries old. It has always been a highly political press. Its strengths have largely been shaped by its historical experience, and in particular by its association with the freedom struggle as well as movements for social emancipation, reform, and amelioration. It is this history that accounts for the seriousness, relevance, and public-spirited orientation of the press at its best. The tradition of a strong and assertive political press has continued into 6 decades of independence. Today, satellite television competes with newspapers aggressively and often breathlessly in trying to influence the political agenda. With their expanded reach, these news media together serve as an effective antidote to any trends of depoliticization in society. Further, there is significant space for the expression of dissent and contrary political opinions. Tens of millions of Indians are voracious consumers of news about politics. Daily newspapers in nearly 24 Indian languages, as well as in English, are their primary source, with news television spicing up the fare. And clearly, political awareness and excitement are good for the media business. Robin Jeffrey speaks of the Crimean War effect and makes the connection strongly. While literacy, basic communications, and adequate technology are a necessary condition for the development of a daily newspaper culture, it is momentous events that provide the link between these developments and politics, the link that seems to send circulations shooting upwards, as Robin Jeffrey points out. The progressive South Indian state of Kerala is the classic Indian case of politicization spreading to large sections of the population, rural as well as urban, and creating a widespread newspaper reading culture. This in turn contributes to the creation of an authentic, democratic public opinion. The dramatic expansion of the Hindi press, the Hindi daily press, over the last quarter century, partly in response to the political and social upheaval generated by Ayodhya-centered communal mobilization by the Hindu right. That's a strikingly different case. The Hindi press has still not been able to live down the ignominy of the Kar Sevak or militant Hindu chauvinist role a large section of it played during the October-November 1991 crisis in Uttar Pradesh, India's most populous state. This has been well documented and indicted in a study commissioned by the Press Council of India, a statutory body. The culpability of influential sections of the Indian media in creating the impression that the Hindu rights mobilization, which led up to the demolition of the historic 16th century mosque, the Babri Masjid, was some kind of nationalist project, has been criticized widely, including by the Citizens Tribunal on Ayodhya. In the case of Gujarat's anti-Muslim pogrom of 2002, which is estimated to have claimed up to 2,000 lives, there was strikingly divergent coverage by the English language and the Gujarati press, while national media coverage has justly been applauded for truth-telling and blowing the whistle on a state-sanctioned genocidal program. It was a sobering fact that the dominant Gujarati print media in the state played an incendiary role in propagating hate and fueling the conflagration. Some of the finest work done by the Indian press, historically and in contemporary times, is its investigation and expose of political corruption, ministerial misconduct, and government misdeeds. In fact, corruption in its myriad forms and tremendous scale presents limitless investigative opportunities to India's independent news media. It also enables them continuously to win strong public support for the work that they do. Here is James Cameron on the phenomenon as of 1974, when its scale was perhaps 1,000th of what it is reckoned to be today. Corruption in India is almost as leaden a cliche as hunger. It is sanctified by the oldest of traditions. It is denied by nobody. Indeed, the totality and pervasiveness of Indian corruption is almost a matter of national pride. Just as India's droughts are the driest, her famines the most cruel, her overpopulation the most uncontrollable, so are all the aspects of Indian corruption and bribery the most wholly spread and spectacular. I have it up there. Given such exciting opportunities to investigate independently, build on investigations done by official watchdog bodies, and do agenda building on the theme of corruption, the press has done itself proud. The Bofors howitzer deal, which was referred to, the howitzer deal scandal, captured the imagination of political India in the late 1980s, so much so that Bofors became a synonym for sleaze and skullduggery in various Indian languages. The opening shot in this case was fired by a well-informed broadcast over Swedish public radio, which then curiously went silent over the affair. The prolonged investigation and document-backed expose of the scandal by the Hindu, in which I played a role, is generally reckoned to have contributed to the downfall of a corrupt government. Bofors was enabled by arbitrary and opaque decision-making on a major military acquisition valued at US $1.3 billion. It featured contractual arrangements to pay bribes aggregating more than $200 million as a quid pro quo for the Indian government's purchase of 410 Swedish howitzers in preference to French howitzers that the Indian Army brass had repeatedly rated as a better buy. About $50 million of this amount was actually paid into secret Swiss bank accounts before the whistle was blown on the corrupt deal. In the last few years, the press and news television has aggressively probed and agitated on a series of corruption scandals that have shaken political India and eroded the credibility of the Manmohan Singh government. This is the Man Booker Prize giving season, and we have quite an exciting short list of contenders. By the way, I haven't read all the books on the short list, but I can't imagine how Hilary Mantel won't do it again. Anyway, here's my short list of India's choicest corruption scandals. The 2G spectrum scam is about the government twisting the rules under a first-come, first-served rather than an auction-based allocation regime to favor mobile telephony companies through undercharging 2G spectrum allocation licenses in return for huge kickbacks. The presumptive loss to the government has been estimated by the Comptroller and Auditor General of India, which is a constitutionally created financial watchdog. It's been estimated to be in the region of US $32 billion. But most of the bribes are yet to be traced by the criminal investigations. The scandal around the 2010 Commonwealth Games held in New Delhi featured massive irregularities, such as the award of work contracts at very high prices, often to ineligible parties, and pervasive corruption in procurement and the award of contracts for the construction of the game venues. The Adarsh Housing Society scam in Mumbai, India's financial capital, involved top politicians, officials, and military officers subverting rules to have a massive high-rise constructed at a prime location and corner flats for themselves at hugely deflated prices. The mining scandal spread across several states has featured the illegal and corrupt mining of ore, especially iron ore meant for export, defrauding the state of mining revenues through ministerial and official collusion, encroachment on forest land, and trampling on the rights of tribal people. The coal block allocation scandal, or Coalgate as it's known to the Indian press, promises to be the biggest of them all. And perhaps one day someone who fictionalizes it will be in contention for a Booker. The CAG, the Comptroller and Auditor General, has exposed the fact that by going for a process of arbitrary allocations or patronage deals instead of competitive bidding, the central government has enabled a windfall game for the allottees worth US $35 billion. In all these cases, the irregularities and suspicious transactions were exposed by constitutionally or statutorily created authorities. But the role of the news media has been crucial in keeping up the heat, contributing new information or angles, and following up, thus helping to build a democratic public agenda on the theme of political corruption. The publication in early 2011 of a series of articles based on the US Embassy cables in India, made available by WikiLeaks, provided the reading public and historians of contemporary India a wealth of information on foreign and domestic policy issues and on corruption, the cover-up of corruption, and ministerial and official misconduct. One cable supplied explosive information of the 2008 cash for vote scandal, where parliamentary votes were sought to be bought to help the Manmohan Singh government squeak through a no-confidence motion in the Lok Sabha, India's House of Commons. Hearteningly, publication of the story in the press triggered the launch of a criminal investigation under the watch of the Supreme Court of India. I must enter a caveat here. Critics have noted correctly that the energy and motivation the Indian news media have shown in going after government and political corruption have been missing in investigating and exposing corporate corruption. The reasons for this I'll go into a little later. I've given you an idea of the democratic role played by influential sections of the Indian news media in the sphere of politics. Unfortunately, when it comes to economic issues and policies, the mainstream media's contribution turns out to be anything but democratic. This was not always the case. Amartya Sen has commended the historical role of Indian newspapers in exposing hunger-related facts on the ground in extreme cases, and in concert with other democratic institutions, preventing the government from pursuing disastrous policies and thus guaranteeing the avoidance of acute starvation and famine. Today, a number of factors operating in the Indian media industry have virtually shut out news, analysis, and comment that challenge the neoliberal economic policies that have held sway over the last 2 decades. Mainstream press and broadcast media coverage has tended to adopt a laudatory tone, keep out or underplay the criticisms and objections, censor the negative socio-economic effects, especially among the poor, and provide little space to the voices of robust criticism and opposition, including those raised from the ranks of professional economists. Critics point out that Indian journalism is facing increasing pressure from proprietors, advertisers, marketing personnel, corporate managers, and even senior journalists to present and prioritize what are known as feel-good factors, rather than highlight the reality of mass deprivations and what to do about them. In several frank conversations with the executives of India's largest newspaper publishing company, Auletta learnt why poverty, especially rural poverty, was not a fit subject for news and editorial coverage, why this coverage had to cater to the aspirational among young readers. Poverty, he was told, is not a condition to which one aspires, and why a newspaper's editorial philosophy, which was derived from its business philosophy, had to be one of optimism. The problem, which is by no means confined to one or a few news organizations, goes way beyond this. The economist Prabhat Patnaik has addressed this subject in an original and unusually perceptive meditation on markets, morals, and the media. There's no time now to go into the details of his argument. They can be read in the original or in summary in the written text of this lecture that will be up at City University London's website as soon as I'm done. It's the conclusion I wish to draw your attention to here. We can call it Patnaik's law on media power in relation to economic issues. And I quote from his convocation address at the Asian College of Journalism several years ago. And I quote, "Where the media are on the same side as international finance capital, they appear powerful. But in fields where they strike out on their own, upholding humane values and expressing concern for the poor and the suffering, they appear powerless. Such powerlessness, he proposes, is the outcome of a process, the process of ascendancy of international financial capital over the economy, which the media paradoxically, with a few honorable exceptions, have avidly supported. Poverty and mass deprivation, basic livelihood issues, the impact of policies on these issues, the state of agriculture and the countryside remain massively undercovered in Indian newspapers and in the broadcast media. The good thing is that the honorable exceptions Patnaik mentions have been significant. P. Sainath's investigations of rural distress, farmers' suicides, and mass migrations are in the finest tradition of people-oriented, investigative, agenda-building journalism. Such influential and iconic work, along with the lively contributions of young, idealistic reporters on these subjects in various Indian languages, suggest a way out of this bind, provided a public culture of valuing such journalism can be built up. Now I turn to what may be called the business of journalism and its impact on journalism itself. Auletta's New Yorker piece, please read it, Citizens Jane, offers an entertaining glimpse of an exotic world of aggressive and unorthodox publishing, hyper-commercialization, and business strategizing that growing newspapers that throws out of the window most of the things we have learned from journalism school or from the elements of journalism. The issue of paid news exploded in the public sphere in the aftermath of the 2009 election, the general election. A section of the press revealed that a large number of newspapers and also several television channels had sold promotional news packages of specified size using an under-the-table rate card to candidates in state assembly and parliamentary elections. There were special rates for negative coverage of your opponents. This involved violations of the law, was tantamount to extortion in several cases, and mocked every rule of ethical journalism. It was as much a rogue practice as the UK's phone hacking affair. The scandal of paid news led to a damning report by a subcommittee of the Press Council and calls for external regulation of the press and the private television channels. It also led to some critical debate on a wider phenomenon, paid news not as a rogue practice, but as a deeper and industry-wide phenomenon that is not confined to election coverage. Auletta's top media interlocutors had no inhibitions in telling him that, quote, "We are not in the newspaper business, we are in the advertising business, a derived business of aggregating a quality audience for advertisers to facilitate consumption." And they had a point, considering that in the top thriving newspaper league, 80 to 90% of the revenues come from advertising and only small change from circulation. Auletta learnt about focus group-led research that put elitist editors, he was told, pompous fellows thundering from the pulpit, speaking in 80-word sentences. In my prime, I did 50, I think about 60, but not 80 in their place. This was research directed by the marketing people into what readers, and especially aspirational young readers, wanted to read, and the consequent restructuring and reinvention of editorial content. Auletta was educated in easy rationalizations of practice of what are known as advertorials, an ad sales initiative that opened a section of the newspaper to promotional or puff pieces paid for by celebrities, brands, and well-heeled ego tripsters, and written not by ad agencies but by the newspaper's reporters. There was some kind of indication that this section was paid for, but Auletta noted that a reader needed a magnifying glass to be alerted to the disclosure in small print. The New Yorker writer also learnt about another business innovation originating from India's largest newspaper publishing company, but now fairly common in the media industry, known as private treaties, a program under which newspapers offer ads to small and medium-sized companies in exchange for equity. The implications of this initiative for editorial coverage of these companies by the newspapers has been much discussed among journalists and critics of the Indian media industry. The inherent conflict of interest even attracted the attention of our Securities and Exchange Board, that is the Securities and Exchange Board of India, known as SEBI, the Indian equivalent of your FSA. This brings me back to the point that the two states which I spoke about, the fortunes of the news industry and the state of journalism, ought not to be conflated. Manipulation of news, analysis, and comment to suit the owner's financial or political interests, the downgrading and devaluing of editorial functions and content in some leading newspaper and news television organizations, systematic dumbing down led by the nose by certain types of market research, the growing willingness within newspapers and news channels to tailor the editorial product to subserve advertising and marketing goals set by owners and senior management personnel, advertorials where the paid-for aspect of the news-like content is not properly disclosed or disclosed at all, private treaties, rogue practices like paid election campaign use, and bribe-taking for favorable coverage. If this is what it takes to have thriving newspapers and other news media, then there's something seriously wrong with this growth path. The debate about the responsibilities of the news media has been sharpened by the trenchant and tireless public criticism from the chairman of our statutory press council, Markandeya Katju, a retired Supreme Court judge. He highlighted three major defects of the media in India. He listed them as frequently diverting attention from serious socio-economic issues to non-issues and trivializing news. Secondly, dividing the people by putting out communal or other divisive messages. And thirdly, promoting superstition and obscurantism instead of rational and scientific ideas. He also criticized, by the way, what he considered to be the relatively low intellectual level of a majority of journalists, their poor general and domain knowledge, and their lack of desire to serve the public interest. So what Not everybody agrees with these bold generalizations and sweeping assertions of our press council chairman, but in my opinion, the Katju critique has been valuable for keeping the focus on relevance and quality issues. The question is, how free are we? An overarching issue for the news media is the state of free speech. Article 19(1)(a) of the Indian Constitution guarantees freedom of speech and expression as a fundamental right. This right, hard won in the freedom struggle against a highly repressive and censorious British Raj, is unamendable. Freedom of the press is not explicitly mentioned by our Constitution, but the Supreme Court has, through judicial interpretation, read it into Article 19(1)(a). Unfortunately, freedom of speech and expression is hemmed in and to a significant extent undone by Article 19(2) of our Constitution. This provides for restrictions on the fundamental right by law, some reasonable, most not. Notable among the unreasonable restrictions that remain on the statute book or are in practice are the law of criminal defamation. We got it from the UK, You've done away with it. We still have it, and it's used in a big way. The undefined power of contempt of court, uncodified legislative privilege, the outrageous law of sedition, 124A of the Indian Penal Code, other illiberal provisions of the Indian Penal Code, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, and other draconian laws enacted in the name of fighting extremism and terrorism. It's a global problem, and we share the worst of it. Free speech has come under serious pressure in India. Consider these examples from the past quarter century. Being the first country in the world to ban Salman Rushdie's satanic verses and carrying through this policy of appeasement of murderous intolerance to the last Jaipur Literary Festival. Criminalizing paintings by India's greatest painter, M.F. Hussain, from 1996 onwards, forcing him into exile in West Asia. Carrying out several acts of localized violence and intimidation against media organizations, journalists, writers, historians, cartoonists, artists, activists, and others. Piling on criminal defamation cases against journalists, with the lower courts hardly applying their mind to prima facie admissibility even under this illiberal law, thus ensuring that the process is the punishment. Blocking text or SMS services in the name of law and order or public order. Notifying under the Information Technology Act 2000 as amended in 2008 illiberal rules, especially the notorious intermediary guideline rules which permit blocking of content on the internet. Threatening to tame the social media, which among other things shows a complete inability to understand the nature and ways of the sharing beast. Using the sedition law against the writer Arundhati Roy. Imprisoning a cartoonist for sedition, with the result that the Indian criminal justice system has itself become a cartoon gone viral on the World Wide Web. This is a period during which many voices within the Indian establishment and the larger media consuming public are demanding accountability, transparency, better standards, an end to paid news and other rogue practices, and effective governance and regulation. The more discerning critical voices make the point that self-regulation either does not exist within the Indian media industry or where it exists is not effective. Self-regulation, the Press Council chairman has proclaimed, is an oxymoron, and no profession can be called a profession unless it has an enforceable code of conduct and sanctions against those who violate it. So what can be the answer? It is likely that freedom of the Indian news media will come under increasing pressure and threat unless they move briskly to set their house in order. They need to ensure that transparency, accountability, and social responsibility are more than slogans. With no codes of values or practice binding journalists and the media industry, and no mechanisms for self-regulation, such as internal news ombudsman in place within major news organizations other than one or two, and I'm glad to say that in 2006, The Hindu adopted the Guardian model of the reader's editor, more or less adopting those terms of reference with very minor alterations. And now we have a third, we've just inducted a third reader's editor or internal news ombudsman in place, completely independent of the editorial, of the editor and the editorial personnel. Over the years, a substantial international literature has appeared on templates for socially and ethically accountable journalism, and also on the constitutive elements of journalism. This has yielded codes of practice, of professional ethics, privileging the principles and values of journalism. It has emphasized such disciplines as fact-checking, investigation, rigorous data sourcing and analysis, providing context and meaning, and maintaining perspective. India and its news media, I believe, can learn valuably from the parallel discussion of media-related issues taking place in the United Kingdom, which has been provoked by the rogue practices of an influential section of your media. The Leveson inquiry has been a stimulating learning experience for us. I follow it very closely. It allowing for the considerable differences in the situations. Many of the testimonies have been first-rate, and the inquiry has gone, I think, quite deep into what it calls the culture, practices, and ethics of the press. As a former editor, I'm pleased that the forward-looking editor of The Guardian has welcomed Leveson as an opportunity for the industry to have a conversation with itself while also benefiting from the perspective and advice of others, and that several other British journalists seem to agree with this. I also know there are apprehensions. There was a recent editorial in the Telegraph which aired those apprehensions. We look forward to the final report or recommendations of Leveson and to seeing what legislative or other practical arrangements might follow. The Indian situation cries out for such an independent, comprehensive, hard look into the culture, practice, and ethics of the news media, and to questions of what kind of regulatory and governance mechanisms can be worked out and put in place. The object must be the same, and I quote from the Leveson's terms, to support integrity and freedom of the press while encouraging the highest ethical standards. Nobody knows what the long term holds for India's news media. It should be possible through some kind of regulation, whether it is self-regulation or some kind of statutory regulation going beyond the Press Council, to reform the system, to put an end to the major ethical transgressions, not to mention rogue practices, such as paid news. But I have no illusions about what it will take to reverse the tendencies that put enormous pressure on independent professional journalism. My personal hope is that feel-good journalism, focus group-led journalism, ad-dictated journalism, journalism that sees no need to take account of basic realities, and in the Indian case, the mass poverty and the multiple deprivations in a country where 2/3 of the population subsist on less than $2 a day, that this can be discredited by good, sensitive, progressive journalism that attracts a substantial measure of public support. Perhaps Gresham's law can be disproved when it comes to journalism, at least in certain sectors and enough spaces. My hope is that effective incentives, moral and material, can be put in place in significant sections of the news media for taking up the basic concerns of hundreds of millions of ordinary Indians and projecting them with social responsibility into the public sphere. Thank you.